She's just a housewife. My husband Dominic laughed during his company's annual holiday party, gesturing dismissively as I balanced a tray of champagne flutes for his colleagues. The entire executive team chuckled while I stood there in my carefully chosen black dress, suddenly feeling like the hired help. His boss Robert raised an eyebrow. Interesting perspective from someone whose wife owns the building we're standing in. The laughter died instantly. I set down the tray, smiled sweetly, and said, "Actually, I prefer landlord. Your lease expires next month, darling, and I'm thinking of renovating." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dominic's face went white as his champagne glass slipped from his trembling fingers. The crystal hit the marble floor of the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire soul. But it wasn't the breaking glass that shattered something inside me. It was the ripple of approving chuckles that followed Dominic's casual dismissal of everything I was. I stood frozen in the center of the gleaming ballroom, surrounded by the city's business elite, holding a silver tray that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The champagne flutes caught the light from the massive chandelier above, creating tiny rainbows that danced across my navy blue dress. The one I'd spent 3 hours choosing, wanting to look perfect for Dominic's biggest night of the year. "She's just a housewife," he'd said. And those 4 words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the conversation. The way he'd waved his hand at me, as if I were invisible furniture that happened to be useful for carrying drinks. The casual laugh that suggested my presence was both expected and forgettable. Terry Blackwood, the company's head of operations and Dominic's closest colleague, had been in the middle of asking about my background when Dominic interrupted. "Don't mind her," he'd added with that charming smile that once made my heart skip. "She keeps busy with her little projects at home." Little projects. 7 years of marriage, and that's how he summarized my existence. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a rage so pure it surprised me. Around us, the party continued, soft jazz playing from the corner where a trio of musicians performed, the gentle clink of silverware against china as servers circulated with hors d'oeuvres, the low murmur of conversations about quarterly reports and market projections. But in our little circle, something had shifted. I saw it in the faces of the people who'd been listening. Terry's uncomfortable expression, Louise Martinez from accounting who was suddenly very interested in her phone, Christopher Hayes from legal who cleared his throat and looked away. Even Hannah Palmer, the newest executive hire who'd been so friendly earlier, now seemed unsure where to look. They were embarrassed for me. These successful professionals, these titans of industry, were witnessing my public diminishment and feeling secondhand shame on my behalf. As I stood there, still holding that damn tray, I had what therapists probably call a moment of clarity. It wasn't just tonight. It wasn't just this party. This was the culmination of 1,000 small humiliations that I'd somehow learned to accept as normal. The charity board meetings where Dominic introduced me as my wife Terry, she has so much free time for volunteering. The dinner parties where he'd interrupt my conversations to ask me to refresh someone's drink or check on the appetizers in the kitchen. The business events where I was seated at the spouse table, expected to smile and nod, while the real professionals discussed important matters at the main tables. When had I become this person? When had I stopped being Terry Richardson, the woman who'd built a commercial real estate portfolio worth $30 million, and become just Dominic's wife? I thought about this morning, how carefully I'd planned everything for tonight. I'd arranged for our housekeeper Maria to work late so Dominic wouldn't have to worry about anything at home. I'd picked up his dry cleaning, made sure his lucky cufflinks were polished, even called ahead to confirm our babysitter for next weekend's client dinner. And what had he done to prepare for my attendance at his company's biggest social event of the year? Nothing. Because in his mind, I wasn't really attending, I was just accompanying him, like an expensive handbag or a nice watch, an accessory that enhanced his image as a successful family man. The tray trembled slightly in my hands as the full weight of my situation settled over me. I wasn't just being dismissed by my husband in front of his colleagues, I was being erased. My identity, my accomplishments, my very existence was being reduced to a supporting role in his professional theater. But as I stood there, surrounded by the soft lighting and elegant decor of the hotel ballroom, something else began to crystallize in my mind. A memory from this morning that suddenly seemed significant in a way I hadn't realized before. I'd received a call from my property manager, Kenneth Walsh, about the lease renewal for the building that housed Dominic's company, Richardson and Associates Financial Planning. The 20-story glass tower on Fifth Avenue that I'd purchased 5 years ago as part of my real estate investment strategy. The building that generated over $2 million in annual rental income. The building where my husband went to work, every day, in the corner office on the 19th floor, never knowing that his landlord was the woman he dismissed as just a housewife. Kenneth had mentioned that the lease was up for renewal in January, and several other financial firms had expressed interest in the space. Premium downtown location, recently renovated, excellent foot traffic. We could easily increase the rent. By 30%, he'd said. Maybe more, given the market conditions. At the time, I'd told him to proceed with the standard renewal terms. After all, why would I want to make things difficult for my husband's company? We were a team, weren't we? Partners in everything? But standing here now, watching Dominic accept congratulations from his colleagues for landing the Morrison account, the deal I'd helped him strategize for 3 months, connecting him with contacts from my own business network, I realized how foolish I'd been. We weren't partners. We weren't even teammates. I was the unpaid help, the invisible support system that enabled his success while receiving none of the credit. The sound of laughter pulled me back to the present moment. Someone had made a joke about wives and their shopping habits, and the circle of executives was chuckling appreciatively. Dominic caught my eye and nodded toward the empty glasses in their hands, a subtle signal that I should continue playing my role as the perfect corporate wife. Instead, I found myself thinking about property law, about lease agreements, about the extensive renovation plans I'd been considering for the Richardson building. Suddenly, those little projects Dominic had dismissed so casually seemed very interesting indeed. I smiled back at him, a smile that probably looked perfectly normal to everyone watching, but felt like a declaration of war on my lips. Then I continued around the circle, serving champagne and playing the gracious hostess, all while my mind raced with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. After all, I was just a housewife. What could I possibly know about business? The drive home from the Meridian Hotel passed in a blur of city lights and silence. Dominic hummed softly to himself, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone, occasionally commenting on conversations he'd had or deals that might be materializing. I made appropriate sounds of interest while my mind replayed the moment over and over. She's just a housewife. Did you see Robert's face when I mentioned the Morrison projections? Dominic asked as we pulled into our driveway in Maple Ridge, the exclusive suburb where we'd lived for the past 4 years. I think we're looking at a promotion announcement after the holidays. Our house stood before us, a colonial revival with perfectly manicured landscaping that I maintained through careful coordination with our gardening service. Every detail was precisely managed, from the seasonal flower rotations to the snow removal schedule. Just like everything else in our life, together, I handled the behind-the-scenes logistics while Dominic enjoyed the results. "That's wonderful, honey," I replied automatically, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Inside, I went through my usual post-event routine, hanging up coats, setting out Dominic's vitamins for the morning, checking that the coffee maker was programmed for his preferred wake-up time. These small acts of service had once felt like expressions of love. Tonight, they felt like evidence of my own complicity in my diminishment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dominic disappeared into his study to check a few emails, which meant he'd be online for at least 2 hours, probably video calling with clients in different time zones or reviewing documents for Monday's meetings. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my heels clicking against the hardwood with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. In our walk-in closet, I carefully hung up the navy dress that had cost $800 and somehow made me invisible. As I changed into my silk pajamas, I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had my shoulders started curving inward like that? When had my smile become so practiced, so empty? I looked like someone who'd been apologizing for her existence for so long that she'd forgotten she had nothing to apologize for. I settled into the reading chair by our bedroom window. But instead of reaching for the novel on my nightstand, I found myself staring out at the city lights in the distance. Somewhere out there was my building, the Richardson Tower, 20 stories of glass and steel that I owned completely and that generated more income in a year than most people made in a decade. The purchase had been strategic, part of my broader real estate investment plan that I'd been building since before I met Dominic. I'd started small, buying a duplex near the university when I was 25, then gradually expanding my portfolio: apartment buildings, office complexes, retail spaces. I'd studied the market, cultivated relationships with developers and city planners, learned to read financial statements and zoning regulations like other people read novels. By the time I met Dominic 7 years ago, I was already financially independent. Not wealthy by billionaire standards, but comfortable enough that I never had to worry about money again. My real estate holdings generated passive income that exceeded 6 figures annually, and my investment accounts grew steadily through careful management and reinvestment. But somehow, in the gradual process of building a life with Dominic, I'd allowed my achievements to become background noise. When people asked what I did, I'd started saying, I managed some property investments, in a way that made it sound like a hobby rather than a business empire. When had that happened? When had I started minimizing my own success to make room for his ego? I remembered our third date when I'd mentioned buying my first commercial property. His eyes had lit up with genuine interest and admiration. That's incredible, he'd said. You're building something real, something that lasts. Most people our age are just paying rent and hoping for the best. That man, the one who'd been excited by my ambition and impressed by my business acumen, seemed like a stranger now. Or maybe I was the stranger. Maybe I'd become someone I didn't recognize in my effort to be the perfect wife. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Hannah, who lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids. How was Dominic's big party? Did you wear the navy dress? I started to type back something cheerful and supportive, the kind of response I always gave. It was lovely. Dominic had a great time networking with clients. But I stopped before hitting send. Why was I protecting him? Why was I still playing the role of the devoted wife even in private conversations with my own sister? Instead, I deleted the message and typed, he introduced me as just a housewife to his entire executive team. I stood there serving drinks like hired help. The response came back immediately. What? Are you kidding me? Terry, you own half the commercial real estate in the downtown district. I stared at her message for a long moment. She was right. I did own a significant portion of downtown commercial real estate. I sat on the boards of 3 different investment groups. I'd been featured in Commercial Real Estate Weekly just 2 years ago as one of the rising stars under 40 in property development. Yet tonight, surrounded by financial professionals who would have been impressed by my portfolio, I'd been reduced to a serving tray and a patronizing pat on the head. Another text from Hannah. Seriously, Terry, when did you start letting him treat you like this? That was the question, wasn't it? When had I started accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from anyone else? When had I begun to shrink myself to fit into his vision of what a wife should be? Downstairs, I could hear Dominic's voice on a conference call discussing market strategies and client relations with the same confidence and authority he'd displayed all evening. He was in his element, commanding attention and respect from colleagues who valued his expertise. Meanwhile, I sat in our bedroom feeling like a stranger in my own life, wondering how I'd managed to become invisible even to myself. But as I scrolled through my phone, looking at emails from property managers and investment advisors, a different feeling began to emerge. These weren't the messages of someone whose opinions didn't matter. These were communications with someone whose decisions affected millions of dollars in assets and dozens of business relationships. Tomorrow was Saturday. Dominic would sleep late, go for his usual run, then spend the afternoon watching football, while I managed household tasks. But maybe this Saturday, I would spend some time reviewing my portfolio, reconnecting with the woman who'd built something impressive before she'd learned to make herself small. After all, I had some very interesting properties to consider. Starting with a certain 20-story building that housed a financial planning firm whose lease was coming up for renewal. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp December air that made everything feel possible. I woke before Dominic, as I always did, and instead of starting my usual routine of preparing his breakfast and laying out his running clothes, I found myself pulled toward my home office, the small room at the back of the house that I'd claimed when we first moved in. As I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee, surrounded by the framed certificates and awards that no one except the housekeeper ever saw, memories began flooding back. Not the painful recent ones, but older memories from before I'd learned to make myself invisible. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found what I was looking for. Pictures from the Commercial Real Estate Investors Conference in Chicago 3 years ago. There I was, standing at a podium addressing 200 industry professionals about urban development strategies. My hair was shorter then, my posture confident, my smile genuine rather than practiced. That was the same conference where I'd met Dominic. Actually, that wasn't quite right. We'd met earlier at a networking mixer 6 months before the conference. But Chicago was where everything changed between us, where what started as casual dating became something deeper. I remembered that first meeting so clearly now. It was at the Riverside Country Club's summer mixer, an event I'd attended reluctantly because my business partner Louise had insisted I needed to get out more and stop living like a hermit with real estate contracts. I'd been standing near the terrace checking emails on my phone when this man approached with 2 glasses of wine. "You look like someone who's either closing a major deal or planning to escape through the garden," he'd said with a grin that seemed genuinely amused rather than practiced. "Is it that obvious?" I'd replied, accepting the wine, though I was actually reviewing tenant applications for a new building I just acquired. His eyes had widened with interest. "Really? Which property?" Most men at these events, when they learned about my work, either changed the subject or started giving me unsolicited advice about real estate markets. Dominic was different. He asked detailed questions about the acquisition process, about market analysis, about my long-term investment strategy. He listened to my answers like they mattered. "Terry Richardson." I'd introduced myself finally, extending my hand. "Dominic Walsh," he'd replied. "And I have to say, you're probably the most interesting person I've met all evening." We'd talked for 2 hours. About business, yes, but also about travel, books, our families. He told me about his work in financial planning, his dreams of expanding, his practice, his frustration with colleagues who seemed more interested in commission structures than actually helping clients. I found myself sharing stories about difficult tenants, successful renovations, the satisfaction of transforming neglected properties into thriving business spaces. When he asked for my number, it felt natural, easy. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of dinners, weekend trips, long conversations about our respective businesses. Dominic was genuinely impressed by what I'd built. He'd asked to see properties I was considering, would review financial projections with me, celebrated when deals closed successfully. "You have an eye for potential that most people miss," he'd told me after I'd shown him through a rundown office building I was planning to renovate. "You see what places could become, not just what they are." But it was in Chicago, at that real estate conference, where I realized I was falling in love with him. I'd been nervous about my presentation. It was my first time as a keynote speaker at such a major event. The topic was adaptive reuse in urban development, and I'd spent weeks preparing, researching case studies, developing a presentation that would showcase some innovative projects I'd completed. Dominic had surprised me by flying out to attend. "I wouldn't miss seeing you in action," he'd said when he appeared in the hotel lobby the night before my speech. The presentation went better than I'd hoped. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions. Several people approached afterward to discuss potential collaborations. I felt confident, accomplished, in my element. But what I remembered most clearly was catching sight of Dominic in the audience. He wasn't just politely listening like someone attending out of obligation. He was leaning forward, taking notes, nodding at key points. His face showed genuine pride and admiration. After my talk, he'd been the first to reach me. "Terry, that was incredible," he'd said, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. "You commanded that room. Everyone was hanging on your every word." That night, over dinner at a restaurant, overlooking Lake Michigan, he'd told me he loved me for the first time. "I love your mind," he'd said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I love how passionate you get when you talk about your work. I love that you're building something meaningful." 2 weeks later, he'd asked me to help him find office space for his expanding practice. "I trust your judgment more than anyone's," he'd explained. "You understand commercial real estate better than any broker I could hire." That's how I'd ended up purchasing the Richardson Tower. I'd found the perfect space for his firm, high floor, great views, room to grow. But the building owner was looking to sell the entire property rather than just lease space. The numbers made sense as an investment, and Dominic was so excited about the location that I'd made an offer that day. "This is perfect," he'd said, standing in what would become his corner office, looking out at the city skyline. "I can see us building something amazing here. Us." We were a team then, partners in every sense of the word. The closing had been in March, just 2 weeks before he proposed. We'd celebrated both milestones with champagne in his new office, making plans for our future together, personal and professional. "We're going to be unstoppable," he'd said, spinning me around in the empty office space. "The Richardson Walsh Empire." I'd laughed, giddy with love and possibility. Everything felt aligned, our relationship, our careers, our shared vision of success. When had that changed? When had us become him and his supporting cast? Sitting in my home office now, looking at photos from that golden time, I could pinpoint the beginning of the shift, though I hadn't recognized it then. It started small, with introductions at networking events. Instead of, "This is Terry Richardson, she owns several commercial properties downtown," it became, "This is my fiancée Terry, she's in real estate." A subtle difference, but the beginning of my transformation from accomplished professional to accessory. Now, staring at the evidence of what I'd built before I'd learned to diminish myself. I felt something stirring that I hadn't experienced in years. Righteous anger mixed with renewed determination. That woman in the photos, the one commanding respect from industry professionals, she was still here. She'd just been buried under years of accommodating someone else's ego. It was time to dig her out. The wedding planning should have been my first warning sign, but I was too intoxicated by love and possibility to recognize the subtle shift happening. Beneath all the excitement and champagne toasts, we'd gotten engaged in April, with Dominic proposing in his new corner office at Richardson Tower, the city sprawling below us through floor-to-ceiling windows. "I want to build a life with you here," he'd said, dropping to one knee against the backdrop of the skyline I'd helped him achieve. "You made this possible, Terry. You found this place. You made the deal happen. I want us to be partners in everything." The ring was stunning, a vintage Art Deco setting that showed he'd been paying attention when I'd mentioned my love for 1920s architecture. For weeks afterward, I'd catch myself staring at it during meetings with contractors or property managers, imagining our future together. Planning the wedding became a full-time obsession for both of us, though in different ways. I threw myself into the logistics with the same methodical attention I applied to property acquisitions, researching venues, coordinating vendors, managing timelines and budgets. Dominic focused on the guest list and networking opportunities. "We should invite the entire Richardson and Associates team," he suggested one evening as we sat in our living room, surrounded by seating charts and vendor contracts. "This could be great for building client relationships." I looked up from the catering menu I'd been reviewing. "Our wedding as a business networking event? Not just networking," he said quickly, perhaps recognizing how that sounded. "But think about it. We're both successful professionals. Why not leverage this celebration to strengthen business connections?" At the time, his enthusiasm felt like another sign that we were true partners. He was proud enough of what we'd built together to want to showcase it publicly. Looking back now, I could see the beginnings of something else, the transformation of our partnership into his platform. The venue we chose was the Grand Ballroom at the Ashford Estate, the same space where my humiliation would play out years later at his company party. Then it had felt like the perfect setting for our new beginning, elegant, sophisticated, with enough space for the 200 guests we'd invited. 200 seems like a lot, my sister Hannah had commented during one of our planning calls. "Are you sure you want something this big?" But Dominic was convinced that a larger celebration would better reflect our combined success. "We're not kids getting married in a backyard," he'd explained. "We're established professionals starting a life together. The wedding should represent that." I'd agreed, caught up in his vision of us as a power couple. Besides, I could afford it. My real estate portfolio was generating steady income, and I'd had a particularly good year with several successful property flips in the downtown arts district. That's when the first real shift occurred, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. "I've been thinking," Dominic said one evening in June, about 2 months before the wedding. "Since you're handling most of the wedding expenses, maybe I should take over more of the actual planning. You know, to balance things out." It seemed reasonable on the surface. I was paying for the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, nearly everything except the rings and his groomsmen's gifts. My contributions totaled close to $60,000, while his were closer to $5,000. "That's sweet." "Of you?" I'd replied. "But I don't mind handling the logistics. I actually enjoy the project management aspect." "But you're already so busy with your properties," he insisted. "Let me take some of this off your plate. I can coordinate with the vendors, handle the final details." Looking back, I should have questioned why someone who claimed to be concerned about my workload was simultaneously planning a wedding designed to showcase his professional network. But at the time, it felt like partnership. He was stepping up, taking responsibility. Gradually, subtly, the dynamic shifted. When vendors called with questions, they started asking for Dominic instead of me. When we met with the wedding planner, she directed most of her comments to him, despite the fact that I was the one signing the checks. "Mr. Walsh has such a clear vision for the event," she gushed during one of our final meetings. "It's wonderful when the groom is so involved in the planning process." I noticed that Dominic didn't correct her assumption that the vision was primarily his. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. After all, what did it matter whose vision it was, as long as we were both happy with the result? The wedding itself was everything we'd planned. Elegant, sophisticated, perfectly executed. The photos were stunning, the food was exceptional, The band kept everyone dancing until midnight. Dominic's colleagues from Richardson and Associates mingled with my contacts from the real estate world, creating exactly the kind of professional networking environment he'd envisioned. But during the reception, I began to notice something that would become a pattern over the next several years. When people congratulated us, when they complimented the venue or the organization, they directed their praise to Dominic. "You really know how to throw a party," Robert Thornton, one of Dominic's senior partners, told him during the cocktail hour. "This whole event is incredibly well done." "Terry has excellent taste," Dominic replied, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass. "She picked out everything." I appreciated the credit, but something about the phrasing bothered me. "She picked out everything" made it sound like I'd been shopping, following his direction rather than managing a complex logistical undertaking. During the toasts, my father spoke about my business accomplishments and my independence before praising Dominic for recognizing my strength. Dominic's best man focused on his career achievements and how lucky he was to find someone who supported his ambitions so beautifully. The difference in framing was subtle, but significant. I was successful, in my own right, but I was also there to support his success. He was successful, and fortunate to have found support. Our honeymoon in Tuscany was blissful. 2 weeks of wine tastings, art museums, and long conversations about our future plans. We talked about expanding both our businesses, maybe starting a family in a few years, possibly investing in some Italian properties I'd researched. "We make a good team," Dominic said one evening as we sat on the terrace of our villa, watching the sunset over the Tuscan hills. "You have the eye for investment opportunities, I have the client relationships. We could build something really special together." I'd agreed wholeheartedly, already imagining the empire we might create. What I didn't realize was that our definitions of together were beginning to diverge in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. By the time we returned from Italy, the first of those changes was already in motion. The business cards Dominic had ordered for his expanding practice listed him as principal of Richardson and Associates, with no mention of the fact that his wife owned the building where that expanding practice was housed. "It's cleaner this way," he explained when I noticed. "Less complicated for clients who don't need to know about our personal financial arrangements." At the time, it seemed like a reasonable business decision. Now, I could see it for what it was: the beginning of my systematic erasure from the narrative of our shared success. The first year of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. We settled into routines that seemed to blend our professional and personal lives seamlessly. I managed my growing portfolio of properties while supporting Dominic's expanding financial planning practice. He brought home stories of new clients and successful investments while I shared updates about renovations and acquisitions. But looking back now, I could see that even then, the language was shifting in subtle ways that I didn't recognize as warning signs. It started with the Christmas party that first December. Richardson and Associates was hosting their annual client appreciation event, and Dominic was excited about introducing me to some of his biggest accounts. "You'll love the Hendersons," he told me as we drove to the venue. "They just inherited a significant estate, and they're looking for property investment opportunities. This could be perfect for you." I'd dressed carefully, a burgundy wrap dress that was professional but festive, paired with the pearl necklace Dominic had given me for our 6-month anniversary. I felt confident, ready to network and potentially gain new clients for my own business. But when Dominic introduced me to James and Patricia Henderson, something felt off. "This is my wife, Terry," he said, his hand on my lower back. "She dabbles in real estate." Dabbles. The word hit me like cold water, but I smiled and extended my hand to the Hendersons. "I specialize in commercial property development and investment," I clarified. "I'd love to discuss some opportunities that might interest you." Patricia Henderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! Are you a broker?" Before I could answer, Dominic jumped in. She owns a few properties around town. Nothing too complicated, but she has good instincts for this kind of thing. I felt my smile tighten, but I didn't want to contradict him publicly. Later, in the car, I brought it up. Dominic, when you introduced me to the Hendersons, you made it sound like real estate is just a hobby for me. He looked genuinely surprised. Did I? I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to keep it casual, not overwhelm them with business talk at a party. His explanation seemed reasonable, and I let it go. But over the next few months, similar incidents accumulated like small cuts. At the grocery store, when we ran into one of his clients, Dominic introduced me as, "My wife Terry, she keeps me organized." When my property manager Kenneth called during dinner, Dominic would joke to whoever was present about Terry's little real estate empire. When I received the Commercial Real Estate Weekly Award for Rising Star Under 40, Dominic posted about it on social media with the caption, "So proud of my wife for this recognition of her property hobby." Each incident was small enough to explain, away. He was being modest on my behalf. He didn't want me to feel pressured to talk business in social settings. He was proud, but didn't want to sound like he was bragging. The pattern became clearer during our first major disagreement about money. I'd been approached by a developer about a joint venture, converting an old warehouse in the Arts District into luxury lofts. The project would require a significant investment on my part, around $1.2 million, but the projected returns were excellent and the timeline was aggressive. "I think we should pass," Dominic said when I brought it up over dinner. "It's a lot of money to risk on something speculative." I set down my fork, confused. "We? This would be my investment, from my accounts. The risk assessment looks solid, and I've worked with this developer before. Terry, we're married now. What affects one of us affects both of us. If this investment goes south, it impacts our entire financial picture." "But the same logic should apply to your business decisions," I pointed out. "When you expanded your practice and hired 2 new advisors last month, you didn't consult me about the financial implications." Dominic's expression shifted, becoming patient in a way that felt condescending. "That's different. That's operational expansion based on existing client demand. This warehouse thing is pure speculation." "It's not speculation when you understand the market dynamics and have done proper due diligence," I replied, feeling my frustration rise. "This is what I do, Dominic. This is my expertise. I know you're good at this stuff," he said, reaching across to pat my hand. "But maybe we should run the numbers by Robert before making any major moves. Get a professional perspective." Robert Thornton, his senior partner, who specialized in retirement planning and had never invested in commercial real estate. I stared at Dominic, trying to understand how we'd gotten to a place where my decade of successful property investment was somehow less valid than Robert's opinion about a sector he'd never worked in. "I am the professional perspective," I said quietly. "Of course you are, honey. I just think it's smart to get multiple viewpoints before committing that much capital." I ended up moving forward with the warehouse conversion without Dominic's blessing, using only my own accounts and decision-making process. The project was completed 8 months later and sold for a 40% profit. When I showed him the final numbers, Dominic congratulated me enthusiastically. "See, I knew you had good instincts," he said, as if his skepticism had been supportive rather than dismissive. But the damage was done. I'd learned that my expertise would always be subject to review by others, while his business decisions were simply accepted as sound. I was good at this stuff, but not quite good enough to be trusted completely. It would be another year before I recognized this as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. But the foundation was being laid for everything that would come later. The revelation came during Thanksgiving dinner in our 3rd year of marriage, when Dominic's parents visited from Phoenix for the long weekend. I'd spent days preparing our house for their arrival. Fresh flowers in every room, a completely planned menu featuring both traditional dishes and some of their favorites I'd researched from previous conversations. Margaret and William Walsh were what you might call old school in their approach to marriage and family dynamics. William had spent 42 years as a senior vice president at a major insurance company, while Margaret had devoted herself to volunteer work and supporting his career. They were proud of their traditional arrangement and not shy about expressing their views on modern relationships. "The problem with young couples today," Margaret announced over dinner, cutting into the prime rib I'd slow roasted for 6 hours, "is that everyone wants to be the star of their own show. No one understands the value of supporting roles anymore." I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth, sensing this was directed toward me but not sure why. William nodded approvingly. "Your mother was the secret weapon behind everything I accomplished," he said, smiling at Margaret with genuine affection. "She made it possible for me to focus completely on building my career because I never had to worry about anything at home." "It's a different world now, Dad," Dominic said carefully. "Women have more options for building their own careers." "Of course they do," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested she didn't view this as entirely positive. "But successful marriages still require someone to be the foundation while the other person reaches for the stars. Two people can't both be reaching at the same time without the whole structure collapsing." I set down my fork, feeling like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. "I think successful marriages are about two people supporting each other's ambitions," I said diplomatically. William chuckled, the kind of indulgent laugh you might give a child who'd said something amusing but naive. "That sounds lovely in theory, my dear. But in practice, someone has to make the compromises. Someone has to be flexible. And traditionally, women are simply better at that kind of adaptability." "Terry's actually quite successful in her own right," Dominic said, and I felt a flush of gratitude until he continued. "She's got several rental properties that keep her busy. Several rental properties. As if my $30 million commercial real estate portfolio was equivalent to being a small-time landlord." "That's wonderful," Margaret said with the same tone she might use to praise a child's finger painting. "It's so important for wives to have interests outside the home. Keeps the mind sharp." Over the next 2 days, I watched the Walsh family dynamics with growing understanding. Margaret anticipated William's needs before he expressed them, refilling his coffee cup, bringing him the newspaper sections in his preferred order, scheduling his doctor's appointments around his golf games. When he told stories about his business accomplishments, she listened with rapt attention, even though she'd obviously heard them dozens of times before. But what struck me most was how William talked about his success. Every achievement was singular, personal. When I closed the Morrison account, when I restructured the Henderson portfolio, when I was promoted to senior vice president. There was never a we in his professional narrative, despite the fact that Margaret had relocated 4 times for his career, had entertained countless clients at dinner parties she'd planned and hosted, had essentially run every other aspect of their life so he could focus exclusively on work. On Saturday afternoon, while I was in the kitchen preparing appetizers for the neighbors we'd invited over, I overheard a conversation between Dominic and his father that made everything crystallize. "She's very accomplished," William was saying, "presumably about me, but you'll need to be careful about maintaining the proper balance." "What do you mean?" Dominic asked. "Men respect other men who have successful wives, up to a point," William explained. "But if she becomes too prominent, if her success starts overshadowing yours, it can create problems. Clients want to work with someone they see as the primary decision maker, not someone whose wife might be calling the shots behind the scenes." "I don't think that's a concern," Dominic replied. "Terry's very supportive of my career." "Good. But as you both become more successful, you'll need to be strategic about how you present things. Let her have her real estate hobby, but make sure everyone understands that you're the business leader in the family." Hobby. There was that word again. "Your mother understood this instinctively," William continued. "She could have pursued her own career, She was valedictorian of her college class, you know. But she recognized that my success would benefit our entire family more than trying to split our focus between two competing ambitions. I stood frozen at the kitchen counter, a cheese knife in my hand, understanding finally flooding through me. This wasn't about Dominic suddenly developing sexist attitudes. This was about him unconsciously absorbing a family template for marriage that had been modeled for him his entire life. In the Walsh family, marriages worked when the wife made herself smaller so the husband could appear larger. Success was measured by the man's achievements, with the woman's contributions remaining strategically invisible. Margaret hadn't been suppressed. She'd been strategic, channeling her considerable intelligence into making her husband successful, rather than competing with him. That evening, after his parents had gone to bed, I tried to address what I'd overheard. "Dominic, I heard your father talking about my career as a hobby. Is that how you see it?" He looked uncomfortable, clearly not wanting to get into this conversation. "You know that's not true. Dad's just from a different generation. He doesn't really understand what you do." But you didn't correct him. There was no point in getting into an argument. You know how proud I am of your success. But as I lay awake that night, listening to Dominic's steady breathing beside me, I realized the problem wasn't whether he was proud of my success. The problem was that he'd learned to view marriage as a zero-sum game, where two people couldn't both be equally visible without threatening the stability of the relationship, and in that model, someone had to agree to be the supporting player. Someone had to be willing to be the foundation while the other person reached for the stars. Somehow, without ever explicitly agreeing to it, I'd been cast in the Margaret Walsh role. The question was, when had I agreed to audition for that part? The changes after that Thanksgiving weekend weren't dramatic. They were surgical. Precise cuts that slowly bled me of professional identity, while maintaining the appearance of a supportive marriage. It started with the networking events. For years, Dominic and I had attended industry functions together as equals, him representing the financial planning sector, me representing commercial real estate development. We'd work the room as a team, introducing each other to valuable contacts, cross-referencing potential business opportunities. But sometime in the spring of our 4th year of marriage, the dynamic shifted. Instead of, "This is my wife Terry, she's the developer behind the Riverside Commons project," the introductions became, "This is my wife Terry, she keeps me grounded." When I tried to steer conversations toward real estate opportunities, Dominic would smoothly redirect. "Terry's got great instincts for property, but tonight's really about connecting with potential financial planning clients," he'd say with a smile that looked supportive but felt like a muzzle. I found myself standing beside him at cocktail parties, smiling and nodding while he discussed market strategies and investment principles with potential clients who might have been interested in diversifying into commercial real estate, if they'd known what I actually did for a living. The shift was so gradual that I didn't recognize it as deliberate at first. When I brought it up, Dominic had reasonable explanations. "We don't want to overwhelm people with competing business pitches," he'd say. "It's better to focus these events on one primary objective." But we've always cross-referenced our businesses at these things. Remember the Patterson account? They came to you for financial planning because they met me first about the downtown office building. That was different. That was organic. This feels more strategic. Strategic for whom? The question hung in the air between us, but I didn't voice it. Not yet. The professional diminishment extended to our social media presence. Dominic had always been active on LinkedIn, posting about market trends and client successes. For the first few years of our marriage, his posts occasionally featured our joint achievements. "Grateful to my wife Terry for connecting me with this fantastic client." Or, "Another successful real estate closing thanks to the Richardson expertise." But, gradually those references disappeared. His professional narrative became entirely singular. When he posted about landing major new accounts, there was no mention of the fact that I'd introduced him to those clients at real estate industry events. When he celebrated his growing practice, there was no acknowledgement that he was operating rent-free in a building I owned. Even more telling was what happened to my own professional visibility. The real estate investment group I'd helped found asked me to step back from the board to avoid any potential conflicts of interest after one of the members mentioned that their financial advisor was my husband. The Commercial Property Developers Association, where I'd served on the education committee for 3 years, somehow forgot to renew my committee appointment. "These things happen," Dominic said when I mentioned feeling increasingly isolated from my professional community. "Maybe it's a good time to focus more on the properties you already own, rather than taking on new projects. Focus on what I already owned. Manage what existed, rather than build what was possible." The suggestion felt like being told to maintain a garden instead of exploring new landscapes. The most insidious change was how Dominic began handling our shared social interactions. At dinner parties, when conversation turned to business topics, he'd place his hand on my knee under the table, a signal I learned meant I should let him take the lead. When friends asked about my work, he'd answer for me before I could speak. "Terry's taking a step back from the big development projects," he'd say. "We're focusing on quality time together rather than both of us being workaholics." I'd smile and nod, playing along with this narrative I'd never agreed to, wondering when we had made these decisions about my career trajectory. The culmination came during a dinner party at Christopher and Bethany Hayes' house. Christopher was a corporate attorney who'd helped me with several property acquisitions, and his wife Bethany ran a successful marketing consultancy. It was exactly the kind of gathering where I'd traditionally felt at home. Successful professionals discussing their work with mutual respect and interest. But when Louise Martinez, who was also there with her husband, asked about my latest projects, Dominic jumped in before I could answer. "Terry's been scaling back recently," he said with the kind of indulgent smile you might give when discussing a child's outgrown interests. "She's realized that managing the properties she already has is really a full-time job." Christopher looked puzzled. "But didn't you just close on that mixed-use development near the university?" I had, 3 weeks earlier. A $2.8 million acquisition that would anchor a new retail district I'd been planning for 2 years. But Dominic's expression suggested this was news to him, even though I'd shown him the closing documents and we'd celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant. "That's more of a passive investment," Dominic said smoothly. "Terry's not really involved in the day-to-day development side anymore." I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching my husband rewrite my professional life in real time. The mixed-use development wasn't passive anything. I'd been working with architects and city planners for months, negotiating zoning requirements, coordinating with contractors. I was scheduled to break ground in 6 weeks, but in Dominic's version of our life, I was settling into comfortable property management rather than pursuing ambitious new projects. I was choosing family balance over professional growth. I was stepping back, scaling down, focusing inward. The most disturbing part wasn't just that he was misrepresenting my choices. It was that he seemed to genuinely believe his version was true. As if my actual activities were less real than his narrative about what a good wife should be doing at this stage of our marriage. That night, driving home in silence, I realized I'd become complicit in my own erasure. Every time I'd smiled and nodded instead of correcting him. Every time I'd let his version of events go unchallenged to avoid conflict. Every time I'd prioritized keeping the peace over maintaining my professional identity. I'd been so busy being a supportive wife that I'd forgotten to insist on being a visible person. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. "Richardson and Associates cordially invites you to our annual holiday celebration." Below the elegant script was the date, December 15th, and the venue, the grand ballroom at the Ashford estate. I held the invitation in my hands, remembering when these events were our celebrations, when I'd helped plan the guest list and menu selection. Now I was simply being invited to attend my husband's party. "This year's going to be special," Dominic said that evening, practically vibrating with excitement as he loosened his tie. "Robert's finally retiring in January, and there's going to be a major announcement about the new partnership structure." I looked up from the financial reports I'd been reviewing, my own reports from my own properties, though I'd learned to keep these activities subtle to avoid Dominic's commentary about my little projects. Partnership structure? The firm's expanding. We're bringing in 2 new senior partners, and there's talk of opening satellite offices. He poured himself a scotch, clearly pleased with whatever role he'd be playing in this expansion. "This party is essentially a celebration of the new direction." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. "Will there be many potential clients there?" "Some of the biggest names in the city. The Henderson Group, Morrison Industries, several tech executives from the Silicon Valley expansion firms. It's going to be the networking event of the year." The Henderson Group. I'd been in preliminary discussions with them about a major mixed-use development project downtown. Morrison Industries was considering relocating their headquarters, and I'd already prepared a proposal for a custom office complex that would meet their specific needs. The tech executives he mentioned were part of a consortium I'd been courting for a new innovation district development. These weren't just potential clients for Dominic. They were active prospects for my own business. People who knew my work, who'd been specifically seeking me out for real estate development opportunities. "That sounds like it could be great for both of us," I said carefully. "I've been working with several of those companies on property development projects." Dominic's expression shifted slightly, the way it always did when I reminded him that my work overlapped with his social circle. "Well, the focus will really be on financial planning services, but I'm sure there will be opportunities for casual conversation about multi-million-dollar development projects that could define the next phase of the city's growth." Over the next few weeks, as Dominic prepared for the party, I watched him practice conversations, review client files, and strategize about how to maximize the networking opportunities. He was treating this event like a carefully orchestrated campaign to solidify his position in the new partnership structure. Meanwhile, I found myself thinking about my own position. The companies that would be attending represented nearly $40 million in potential development projects I'd been pursuing. But apparently, I'd be attending as Dominic's wife, rather than as a commercial real estate developer with legitimate business relationships with these same clients. The dress I chose was strategic, navy blue, elegant but professional, expensive, enough to signal success, but not flashy enough to draw attention away from Dominic. I'd learned to calibrate my appearance to support his image rather than establish my own. The morning of the party, I received a call from Kenneth Walsh, my property manager, about the Richardson Tower lease renewal. "The paperwork came back from their attorneys," he said. "They're requesting a 5-year extension at current rates, with an option for another 5 years. Pretty standard terms, though they're asking for some modifications to the maintenance clauses." I found myself staring out the window at the city skyline, where I could see the top floors of my building in the distance. "What kind of modifications?" "Nothing major. They want to handle their own cleaning services, some flexibility on the elevator maintenance scheduling, the kind of things growing businesses usually request when they're planning for expansion." Growing businesses. Dominic's practice was indeed growing, partly because he was operating in prime downtown real estate at below-market rates. The rent I charged Richardson and Associates was about 30% less than comparable spaces, a decision I'd made when we were newlyweds, and everything felt like ours, rather than his and mine. What would market rate be for that space now? I asked. Kenneth paused, probably pulling up his analysis. Comparable properties in that area are running about $12,000 per month for that square footage. You're currently charging them $8,000. $4,000 a month in below-market rent, $48,000 a year. Over the course of our marriage, I'd essentially subsidized Dominic's business expansion to the tune of nearly $200,000, money that had contributed directly to his professional success while remaining invisible in any narrative about how that success had been achieved. Mrs. Walsh, should I proceed with the renewal at current terms? I looked at the party invitation propped against my coffee cup, imagining myself standing in that ballroom in a few hours, smiling and making small talk while being introduced as just a housewife to clients who should have been seeing me as a business partner. Let me think about it, I said. I'll get back to you next week. That afternoon, as I applied makeup for the party, I found myself thinking about visibility and invisibility, about the difference between being present and being seen. I would be at this party, surrounded by some of the most important business leaders in the city, many of whom had specifically sought out my expertise for major development projects. But I would be invisible in every way that mattered professionally. A pretty accessory to enhance Dominic's image as a successful family man, rather than an accomplished developer in my own right. As I fastened the pearl earrings Dominic had given me for our anniversary, I made a decision. Tonight, I would play the role he'd assigned me perfectly. I would smile, serve drinks if necessary, and listen to him dismiss my expertise in front of people who valued it highly. But I would also pay attention. I would watch how he presented our life, our success, our partnership. I would note who was impressed by his accomplishments and who might be surprised to learn the full story behind them. After all, the people attending this party weren't just his networking opportunities. They were mine too, whether he recognized it or not. And some of them might be very interested to learn who actually owned the building where Richardson and Associates conducted all that impressive business expansion. The Ashford estate looked magnificent that evening, transformed into exactly the kind of elegant networking venue Dominic had envisioned. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over clusters of the city's business elite, while servers in black and white uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I recognized faces from magazine covers and newspaper business sections, tech CEOs, real estate moguls, investment firm partners, the kind of people who moved millions of dollars with handshake agreements. I should have felt at home in this environment. These were my peers, people who understood the complexities of large-scale business development, who appreciated strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking. Instead, I felt like I was wearing a costume, playing the role of the supportive wife while my actual professional identity remained locked away. Dominic was in his element, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged. Here, he'd positioned himself near the bar area, where people naturally gathered, creating opportunities for casual introductions that could become business relationships. "Terry, you remember James Henderson from Henderson Group," he said, guiding me into a conversation circle that included several people I'd been working with professionally. "And this is Patricia Morrison from Morrison Industries." I smiled warmly, extending my hand to Patricia, who I'd met 3 times in the past month to discuss their headquarters relocation project. But her expression was politely blank, clearly not placing me outside of my professional context. "Lovely to meet you," she said. "Actually, I started to remind her about our recent meetings, but Dominic smoothly interrupted. "Terry keeps me organized," he said with an affectionate laugh. "I don't know what I'd do without her managing all the details at home." The way he said it, warm, appreciative, completely dismissive, effectively ended any possibility of me re-establishing my professional identity in this conversation. Patricia nodded politely and turned back to discussing quarterly projections. With James Henderson, the exact topic I'd been hoping to discuss with her regarding the Morrison Industries project. I spent the next hour in a kind of professional purgatory, moving through conversations with people who knew my work but didn't recognize me without my business context. Listening to discussions about projects I was actively involved in while being introduced as someone whose primary contribution was keeping Dominic grounded and organized. The breaking point came when Christopher Hayes approached our group, bringing with him two executives from the tech consortium I'd been courting for the Innovation District development. Dominic. Great. Party, Christopher said, then turned to me with genuine warmth. Terry, I've been meaning to call you about the Peterson property. The zoning committee approved your proposal. Congratulations. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who would acknowledge my professional existence. But before I could respond, Dominic stepped smoothly into the conversation. Terry dabbles in some property management, he said, that familiar dismissive phrase delivered with a smile. Nothing too complicated, but she has good instincts. Christopher looked confused. Property management? Terry, didn't you just close on that? $15 million Innovation District project? The moment stretched uncomfortably. I could see Dominic's jaw tighten slightly, his smile becoming more forced. The tech executives were listening with interest, probably wondering why someone involved in $15 million deals was being described as dabbling in property management. Terry handles some of our family investments, Dominic said, his hand finding my lower back in what looked like an affectionate gesture but felt like a warning. She's very supportive of my practice. That's when I felt something snap inside. Me? Not dramatically, not visibly, but with the quiet finality of a thread that had been stretched too far for too long. Actually, I said, my voice calm and clear, the Innovation District is my project. I've been developing it for the past 2 years. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by one of the tech executives. Wait, you're Terry Richardson? We've been trying to schedule a meeting with you for months. Your office said you were booked solid through January. Dominic's face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise, confusion, something that might have been panic. Terry, I think there might be some confusion. No confusion, I said, meeting the tech executive's eyes directly. I've been looking forward to discussing the Innovation District with your consortium. The project includes space specifically, designed for tech startups and established firms looking to expand. That's fantastic, the second executive said. We had no idea you were married to Dominic. Small world. And that's when Dominic made his fatal mistake. Instead of gracefully acknowledging the connection, instead of allowing me to have this professional conversation, he doubled down on his narrative. She's just a housewife, he said with that dismissive laugh I'd heard so many times before. She has some little real estate projects, but let's be honest, she keeps busy playing at business while I handle the real work. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, the conversation had stopped. People were staring, some with curiosity, others with visible discomfort at witnessing such a public dismissal. Christopher Hayes looked like he'd been slapped. Dominic, I think you might be confused about what Terry does for a living. But the tech executives were exchanging glances, and I could see them making mental notes. This was exactly the kind of scene that would be repeated in boardrooms and business dinners across the city within days. James Henderson cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should... Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet in our area of the ballroom. I think there's something you should all know. I looked directly at Dominic, seeing confusion and the first hint of fear in his eyes. He was finally beginning to realize that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. The building where Richardson and Associates operates, I continued. The 19th floor of Richardson Tower on 5th Avenue? I own it. The lease comes up for renewal next month, and I've been reconsidering the terms. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the party seemed to fade as the implications of what I'd just revealed settled over the group. Dominic's face had gone completely pale. The confident, dismissive expression was replaced by something approaching horror as he began to understand exactly how much trouble he was in. The ride home from the party was conducted in complete silence. Dominic gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while I stared out the passenger window, watching the city lights blur past. The weight of what had just happened sat between us like a third passenger, unwelcome and unavoidable. It wasn't until we were inside our house, the front door closing behind us with its familiar soft click, that Dominic finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" His voice was controlled, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "You completely blindsided me in front of my colleagues." I set my purse on the entry table, taking my time with removing my coat. "I told the truth. That's all." "The truth? You made it sound like I've been lying about what you do for a living. Haven't you been?" I turned to face him, and for the first time in years, I didn't try to soften my expression or manage his reaction. "When did I become just a housewife, Dominic? When did my $15 million projects become little real estate dabbling?" He ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to regain control of the narrative. "You know I respect your work, but there's a time and place for everything. Tonight was about my business, my colleagues. You didn't need to turn it into a competition." "A competition?" The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "I was having a professional conversation with people I work with. You're the one who made it personal by dismissing me in front of them." "I didn't dismiss you. I was being modest on your behalf." That phrase, "modest on your behalf," crystallized something that had been building in my mind all evening. How many times had Dominic claimed to be protecting me, speaking for me, managing my image for my own good? "I don't remember asking you to be modest on my behalf," I said quietly. Dominic's expression shifted, becoming the patient, slightly condescending look I'd learned to recognize as his way of handling what he perceived as my emotional reactions. "Terry, I think you might be overreacting to what was really just a social misunderstanding." Overreacting. Another familiar phrase in Dominic's vocabulary for any time I questioned his version of events. I left him standing in the foyer and went upstairs to our bedroom, but instead of beginning my usual evening routine, I found myself sitting at my dressing table, staring at my reflection, and really seeing myself for the first time in months. When had I started looking so diminished? My posture was defensive, my expression cautious. Even my hair seemed styled to avoid drawing attention. I looked like someone who'd been trained to take up as little space as possible. The next morning, Saturday, Dominic left early for his weekly golf game with Robert and some other partners from the firm. "Damage control," he'd said tersely before leaving. "Thanks to last night, I need to smooth some ruffled feathers." I waited until his car disappeared down our street before I opened my laptop and began what would become the most important research project of my life. I started with something simple, a thorough review of my own business activities over the past 3 years. When had I last been quoted in a commercial real estate publication? When had I last attended an industry conference as a presenter rather than just an attendee? When had I last been approached directly by major clients instead of having opportunities filtered through Dominic's professional network? The pattern that emerged was both subtle and devastating. Gradually, systematically, I'd been edited out of my own professional life. My name had disappeared from industry publications. My direct client relationships had been redirected through Dominic's social connections. My expertise had been reframed as supportive rather than primary. But the real discovery came when I started investigating the Richardson Tower lease agreement. I pulled up the original documents from when I'd purchased the building 5 years ago. The lease I'd given Richardson and Associates was indeed significantly below market rate, a decision I'd made as a new wife wanting to support her husband's growing practice. But what I found when I dug deeper made my stomach drop. The lease had been modified twice since the original signing, both times in ways that favored the tenant. Maintenance responsibilities that should have remained with Richardson and Associates had been transferred to me as the building owner. Utility costs that should have been part of their operating expenses were now absorbed into the base rent, saving them thousands of dollars annually. Most disturbing of all, there was a clause I didn't remember agreeing to. One that gave Richardson and Associates the right of first refusal if I ever decided to sell the building, at a price determined by independent appraisal rather than market value. I stared at the documents, trying to remember signing these modifications, but the signatures were mine, notarized and legal. That's when I started looking more carefully at our joint financial accounts. What I found sent ice through my veins. Over the past 2 years, Dominic had been making what he labeled as property management payments from our joint account to Richardson and Associates, $800 a month, supposedly for handling building maintenance coordination. Except I'd never authorized these payments. And Richardson and Associates wasn't managing any aspects of the building. That was handled by Kenneth Walsh, my actual property management company. I pulled up the bank statements for the past year, tracing every transaction. Business dinners. Charged to our personal account, but labeled as client entertainment for Terry's properties. Conference fees for events Dominic had attended, but claimed were for real estate industry research. Even a subscription to a commercial property database that I'd never used but was being paid for from my business account. The financial picture that emerged showed something I'd never imagined. Dominic hadn't just been diminishing my professional identity socially. He'd been systematically redirecting my business resources to support his own career advancement. By the time I heard his car in the driveway that afternoon, I had assembled a portfolio of evidence that painted a picture of financial manipulation spanning nearly 3 years. Every questionable transaction documented, every modified agreement reviewed, every redirected resource cataloged. I closed the laptop and went downstairs to greet my husband, but for the first time in our marriage, I was seeing him clearly. Not as the man I'd fallen in love with, not as the partner I'd thought we were building a life with, but as someone who'd been systematically stealing both my identity and my resources while convincing me it was for my own good. "How was golf?" I asked when he came through the door. "Fine," he replied, but his expression was tense. "We need to talk about last night, about how we're going to handle this going forward." I smiled, the same pleasant smile I'd been giving him for years. "Of course, I think there's quite a lot we need to discuss." Sunday morning brought revelations that made Saturday's discoveries look like minor accounting errors. While Dominic slept late, recovering from what he'd called a difficult conversation with the partners, I continued my deep dive into our financial arrangements. What I found in his email account, password still Richardson 2019, pathetically predictable, shattered any remaining illusions about the man I'd married. The correspondence with Robert Thornton painted a picture of systematic deception that took my breath away. Thread after thread of emails discussing managing Terry's involvement in business opportunities that rightfully belonged to me. The Morrison Industries deal would be perfect for Terry's development company, Robert had written 6 months ago, but they specifically requested a financial planning component. Maybe we position this as a Richardson and Associates project with Terry providing real estate consulting? Dominic's response made my hands shake. "I think it's better if we handle Morrison directly. Terry gets too emotionally invested in these big projects, and clients respond better to a single point of contact. I can coordinate any real estate components she might contribute. Too emotionally invested in $15 million development projects that I'd been pursuing for over a year. The email trail revealed a pattern spanning 2 years. Opportunities that came to me first, then quietly redirected to Dominic's firm with my involvement either minimized or eliminated entirely. The Henderson Group headquarters project, the university expansion consulting contract, even the Innovation District development that I'd thought was purely my achievement. In every case, Dominic had positioned himself as the primary contact while relegating me to a supporting role when I was included at all. But the most damaging discovery came in an email thread from just 3 weeks ago discussing the Richardson Tower lease renewal. Terry mentioned the lease is up soon, Dominic had written to Robert. "I think we need to be strategic about the renewal negotiations. She's been talking about raising the rent to market rates." Robert's response was chilling. Can you handle the negotiations directly? Might be easier if the business conversation stays separate from the marriage conversation, if you know what I mean. Already on it, Dominic had replied. She trusts me to handle the business details. I can probably get another 5-year extension at current rates. Maybe even negotiate some improvements. She's not really focused on the commercial side of things, lately anyway. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. They were discussing my property, my investment, my financial future as if I were an absent-minded child who needed to be managed rather than consulted. The final piece of the puzzle came in an email from just last week, sent to someone named Tanner Brooks at Westside Development Group, a company I'd never heard of. The Richardson Tower deal should be straightforward, Dominic had written. Once we get the lease extension locked in at current rates, the purchase option becomes much more attractive. Terry's focused on domestic projects right now, so she's not paying close attention to the commercial portfolio. Timing should be perfect for the transition we discussed. Purchase option. Transition we discussed. I scrolled through more emails, my horror growing with each revelation. Dominic hadn't just been manipulating our lease agreement. He'd been planning to trigger the right of first refusal clause and arrange for a third party to purchase my building at below market value. My building, the cornerstone of my real estate portfolio. The property that generated over $2 million in annual income. And he'd been planning to steal it right out from under me while I played the role of the oblivious housewife who was too emotionally invested to handle serious business decisions. I closed the laptop and sat in my home office, surrounded by awards and certificates that documented a career he'd systematically been erasing, planning the most important strategy session of my life. The woman in those photos, the confident developer who'd commanded respect from industry leaders, was still here. She'd been buried under years of gaslighting and manipulation, but she was still here. And she was absolutely furious. By Monday morning, I had transformed from the woman who'd been serving drinks at a company party into someone Dominic wouldn't recognize, a strategic thinker with access to resources he'd forgotten I possessed. My first call was to Louise Martinez, my former business partner who now ran her own commercial litigation firm. We'd maintained a friendship even after she'd moved into law, and she was one of the few people who remembered exactly who I'd been before I'd learned to make myself small. Terry? Her voice was surprised but warm. I haven't heard from you in months. How are things? I need a lawyer, I said without preamble. A very good one who specializes in financial fraud and property law. The silence that followed was brief, but telling. Louise had always been quick to read between lines. Are we talking about divorce proceedings or something more serious? Both. And Louise? I need someone who won't be intimidated by Richardson and Associates. They have Robert Thornton's firm on retainer, and those connections run deep in this city. Ah, understanding colored her voice. That kind of serious. Are you safe? Do you need somewhere to stay? The concern in her question reminded me how isolated I'd become. When had I stopped having friends who would ask if I was safe? I'm fine physically. But financially and legally, I think I'm in more trouble than I realized. And I think Dominic is too. He just doesn't know it yet. Louise was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her shifting into attorney mode. Okay, I need you to document everything before we meet. Every financial transaction, every modified agreement, every conversation you can remember. And Terry, don't let him know you're investigating. If this is what I think it is, we need to preserve evidence before he has a chance to clean up his tracks. After hanging up, I spent the rest of Monday creating a comprehensive timeline of my marriage, alongside a parallel timeline of my disappearing professional identity. The pattern was devastating in its clarity. Every major step forward in Dominic's career had corresponded with a step backward in my visibility. When he'd landed the Henderson Group account, I'd lost my position on the real estate development board. When Richardson and Associates had expanded to include retirement planning services, I'd stopped being quoted in industry publications. When he'd been promoted to senior partner, I'd somehow become just a housewife who dabbled in property management. The systematic nature of it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Almost Tuesday brought my first meeting with Caroline Webb, the attorney Louise had recommended. Caroline specialized in high-asset divorce cases involving business fraud, and her reputation for taking down men who'd underestimated their wives was legendary. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, reviewing the documents I'd prepared, "this is one of the most comprehensive cases of financial manipulation I've seen. Your husband hasn't just been diminishing your professional identity. He's been systematically stealing your business opportunities and planning to acquire your primary asset at a fraction of its value." She looked up from the papers, her expression sharp with the kind of focus that made me understand why Louise had recommended her. "The question is, how badly do you want to destroy him?" Caroline's question hung in the air between us like a challenge. How badly did I want to destroy him? The answer surprised me with its clarity. "Completely," I said without hesitation. "But, legally, I want him to lose everything the same way he tried to take everything from me." Caroline smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Then we're going to need more than just financial evidence. We need people who can testify to the pattern of professional sabotage, people who witnessed the systematic erasure of your career." That's how I found myself, 2 days later, sitting in a coffee shop downtown with Bethany Hayes, Christopher's wife who ran the marketing consultancy. I'd called her under the pretense of discussing a potential collaboration, but my real agenda was very different. "Terry, I have to ask," Bethany said after we'd ordered. "What happened at the Richardson party last week?" Christopher came home talking about how uncomfortable that whole scene was. I'd been planning to ease into this conversation, but Bethany's directness gave me an opening I hadn't expected. "What did Christopher tell you?" "That your husband seemed to have no idea what you actually do for a living. That he was dismissing multi-million-dollar projects as hobbies while you stood there looking like you wanted to disappear." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Terry, we've known you for 4 years. You're one of the most accomplished developers in the city. What's been going on?" For the first time in years, I told someone the complete truth about the gradual erosion of my professional identity, about the financial manipulation I'd discovered, about the systematic way Dominic had been redirecting my business opportunities to his own benefit. Bethany listened with growing horror, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her sharp business mind. "The Morrison Industries project," she said finally. "You were the primary contact on that, weren't you? I remember Patricia mentioning you specifically when she was talking about the headquarters relocation. I've been working with them for over a year, but somehow Dominic convinced them to work with Richardson and Associates instead, with me providing consulting support." "Jesus." Bethany shook her head. "Terry, this isn't just marriage problems. This is professional fraud." That afternoon, Bethany connected me with Hannah Porter, a journalist at Commercial Real Estate Weekly who'd been following the city's development boom. Hannah had actually tried to interview me 6 months ago for a feature on emerging female developers, but the interview had been mysteriously canceled. "Your husband's office called and said you were taking a sabbatical from major projects," Hannah explained when we met. "They suggested I focus on other developers instead." Another piece of the puzzle. Dominic hadn't just been diminishing my role in existing projects. He'd been actively blocking new opportunities for professional visibility. But the most valuable ally came from an unexpected source: Kenneth Walsh, my property manager who'd been quietly documenting irregularities in the Richardson Tower account for months. "I've been wanting to discuss this with you," he said when I called him in for a meeting. "The lease modifications, the payment redirections, the maintenance cost transfers. None of it made sense from a property management perspective. But every time I tried to bring it up, your husband said you'd authorized everything." Kenneth pulled out a thick folder. "I kept copies of everything, just in case. Something felt wrong about the whole arrangement. Inside that folder was documentation of every unauthorized change to the lease, every questionable financial transfer, every decision that had been made in my name without my knowledge. "Kenneth," I said, looking through the evidence he'd preserved, "how would you feel about testifying to all of this?" His smile was grim but determined. "Mrs. Richardson, I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 2 years. By the end of the week, I had assembled a coalition of witnesses who could document every aspect of Dominic's systematic campaign to erase me from my own professional life. Business associates who'd been told I was stepping back, clients who'd been redirected to Richardson and Associates, industry colleagues who'd been informed I was focusing on domestic projects. Each conversation revealed another layer of the deception, another instance where Dominic had spoken for me, decided for me, erased me from opportunities that rightfully belonged to me. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was rebuilding a professional network that had been systematically dismantled, reconnecting with a community that had been told I no longer existed. The woman who'd been dismissed as just a housewife was assembling an army. 3 weeks after, the party that had changed everything, I sat in Caroline's office reviewing the final strategy that would dismantle Dominic's life as methodically as he'd dismantled mine. "The timing has to be perfect," Caroline explained, spreading documents across her conference table. "We serve the divorce papers and file the fraud complaint simultaneously. By the time he understands what's happening, all his assets will be frozen and his business relationships will be under legal scrutiny." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The evidence we'd gathered painted a clear picture of financial fraud, professional sabotage, and systematic theft of business opportunities. But more than that, we had testimony from witnesses who could document the deliberate erasure of my professional identity. "The Richardson Tower lease gives us our strongest leverage," Caroline continued. "He's been operating under a modified agreement that you never legally authorized, while planning to trigger a purchase option that would essentially allow him to steal your primary asset." I reviewed the lease documents one more time, still amazed by the audacity of what Dominic had attempted. The building that housed his prestigious practice, the cornerstone of his professional image, was entirely dependent on my financial forbearance. And he'd been planning to take it from me while convincing me I was too emotionally invested to understand business. "What about the West Side Development Group connection?" I asked. "Tanner Brooks has been very cooperative since we approached." "Him?" Caroline smiled grimly. "Apparently, he had no idea that Dominic was arranging the purchase without the actual owner's consent. He's agreed to provide documentation of their entire arrangement in exchange for immunity from fraud charges." The irony was perfect. Dominic's conspiracy to steal my building had required him to involve outside parties who could testify against him once they understood they'd been participating in fraud. My phone buzzed with a text from Kenneth Walsh. "Lease expiration notice ready for delivery. Just say when." Tomorrow was January 15th. Richardson and Associates' lease officially expired at midnight. For weeks, Dominic had been confidently telling his partners that the renewal was handled, that his wife was fine with the current arrangement. He had no idea that instead of a renewal, he'd be receiving an eviction notice along with a bill for back rent calculated at market rates for the past 3 years. Nearly $200,000 in rent adjustments, plus penalties for unauthorized lease modifications. "There's one more thing," Caroline said, pulling out a final folder. "We've arranged for the fraud investigation to include Richardson and Associates client accounts. If Dominic has been redirecting business opportunities that rightfully belonged to you, the State Ethics Board will want to review how he acquired those clients." I thought about Robert Thornton, about the partners who'd probably been complicit in diminishing my role while benefiting from my redirected business. They'd all assumed that the quiet wife serving drinks was someone they could safely ignore. "When do we move?" I asked. "Monday morning. Divorce papers served at his office, fraud complaint filed simultaneously, lease termination delivered by courier, and ethics investigation launched. Caroline's smile was sharp with anticipation. By noon, his entire professional world will be collapsing. That evening, I went through my closet and selected what I'd wear on Monday. Not the subdued colors I'd learned to favor, not the styles designed to avoid drawing attention. Instead, I chose a sharp red suit that commanded respect. The one I'd bought for the commercial real estate conference 3 years ago, but had never worn because Dominic thought it was too aggressive. Perfect. Sunday night, I sat in my home office surrounded by the awards and certificates that documented who I'd been before I'd learned to make myself invisible. Tomorrow, I would reclaim that identity completely. Dominic was downstairs watching television, probably planning how he'd handle the lease renewal meeting he thought was scheduled for later in the week. He'd mentioned that Robert wanted to discuss expanding Richardson and Associates once the building situation was stabilized. Almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then I remembered the emails about managing my involvement, about my being too emotionally invested, about the plans to steal my building while I was focused on domestic projects. The woman who'd been serving drinks at that party 3 weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone Dominic had forgotten existed, a successful businesswoman with resources, connections, and a very clear understanding of exactly how much he'd stolen from her. Tomorrow, he'd remember who I really was. Monday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp January clarity that made everything feel sharp and purposeful. I woke before my alarm, showered deliberately, and put on the red suit with the care of someone donning armor for battle. Dominic was already downstairs, humming while he prepared his coffee, a man without a care in the world, confident that his carefully constructed life would continue exactly as he'd planned. "You're up early," he said when I appeared in the kitchen. "Important meeting today?" "Very important," I replied, pouring myself tea instead of coffee. I needed to stay calm. Focused. "You?" "Just the usual Monday morning catch-up with the team. Robert wants to discuss the expansion plans now that we've got the building situation settled." He straightened his tie with satisfaction. "Should be a good day." I watched him gather his briefcase and keys. This man who'd systematically stolen my professional identity while convincing me it was for my own good. In 3 hours, his world would begin collapsing, and he had absolutely no idea. "Have a wonderful day, darling," I said, kissing his cheek with the same affection I'd shown him for 7 years. At 10:47 a.m., I was sitting in my car across the street from Richardson Tower, watching through the tall windows as Dominic moved around his 19th floor office. My building, my property, my investment that he'd been planning to steal. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Process server is in the building. ETA 3 minutes." At 10:50 a.m. exactly, I watched a young woman in a business suit enter Dominic's office. Through the windows, I could see the conversation. Polite at first, then confused, then increasingly agitated as Dominic read the documents she'd handed him. Divorce papers, fraud complaint, asset freeze notification. 3 weeks of methodical preparation distilled into legal documents that would shatter his carefully constructed narrative. My phone rang. Dominic's number. "Terry, what the hell is this?" His voice was tight with panic. "There's a woman here claiming you're divorcing me and filing fraud charges. This has to be some kind of mistake." "No mistake," I said calmly. "Check your email. The lease termination notice should have arrived about 10 minutes ago." The silence that followed was profound. I could practically hear him processing the implications. The divorce, the fraud investigation, the loss of his office space, the asset freeze that would prevent him from accessing the business accounts he'd been raiding. "Terry, you can't be serious about this. We can work whatever this is out. Just call off your lawyers and come home so we can discuss it." "Actually, Dominic, I'm right across the street. Wave." I saw him appear at the window, scanning the street until he spotted my car. Even from 19 floors up, I could see the confusion and growing fear in his posture. "You're watching me? I wanted to see your face when you realized that the building you've been planning to steal actually belongs to the woman you've been calling just a housewife." The process server had left. Dominic was alone in his office, divorce papers in his hand, staring down at the wife he'd underestimated for so long. "The Richardson Tower lease expired at midnight," I continued. "You're now officially trespassing in my building. Security will be up shortly to escort you out." "Terry, this is insane. You can't just—" "I can. I did." "And Dominic? That lease renewal you told Robert was handled? The one you used to convince your partners to invest in expansion plans? You might want to let them know there's been a change of circumstances." I ended the call and watched as he frantically began making phone calls, probably to Robert, possibly to lawyers, definitely to anyone who might help him understand how his perfectly controlled world had just exploded. At 11:15 a.m., security arrived at his office. I watched as 2 uniformed guards spoke with him, clearly explaining that he needed to gather his personal belongings and leave the premises immediately. The man who'd dismissed me as someone who dabbled in real estate was being evicted from the building I owned, while fraud investigators froze the business accounts he'd been systematically raiding. Phase 1 was complete. The confrontation had begun. By 2 p.m., news of Richardson and Associates' sudden eviction had spread through the financial district like wildfire. I sat in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel, the same venue where Dominic's company had held their holiday party just a month ago, waiting for the meeting that would complete my revenge. James Henderson and Patricia Morrison had requested an emergency meeting to discuss their projects, clearly concerned about the chaos surrounding their financial advisor. They arrived together, both looking professionally concerned, but personally curious about the woman who'd apparently orchestrated the downfall of one of the city's rising financial planning firms. "Terry," James said as they approached my table, "we have to admit, we're completely confused about what's happening with Richardson and Associates." "And with your role in all of this?" Patricia added. "When we met you at Dominic's party, he introduced you as his housewife. But we've been getting calls all morning about lease disputes and fraud investigations involving the building owner." I gestured for them to sit, then pulled out a leather portfolio that contained the proposals I'd been working on for months. The real proposals, not the watered-down consulting roles Dominic had been offering on my behalf. "Let me clarify a few things," I said, opening the portfolio to reveal detailed development plans, financial projections, and architectural renderings. "I'm Terry Richardson, principal owner of Richardson Development Group. I specialize in large-scale commercial real estate projects, and I've been trying to work with both of your companies for over a year." Their expressions shifted from confusion to recognition to something approaching embarrassment. "The Morrison Industries headquarters relocation project you've been discussing with Richardson and Associates?" I continued. "Those were my development plans, my site recommendations, my financial structures. Dominic was essentially acting as an unauthorized middleman." Patricia's face went pale. "The $15 million Innovation District project we heard about? Mine. Along with the Henderson Group mixed-use development, the University Expansion Consulting contract, and approximately $40 million worth of other projects that were redirected to Richardson and Associates without my consent." James E. leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications. "So, when Dominic was presenting our headquarters options, he was using your work." "My work, my contacts with city planners, my relationships with construction firms, my analysis of zoning regulations." I turned to a page showing the original development timeline. "This is what you would have received if you'd been working directly with me instead of through someone who was systematically stealing my business opportunities." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These weren't just clients anymore. They were witnesses to professional fraud on a massive scale. There's something else you should know, I said, pulling out a final document. Richardson Tower, where Richardson and Associates was operating. I own it. The entire building. Dominic's impressive corner office with the city views. He was essentially working rent-free in space I was subsidizing. Patricia looked stunned. He never mentioned that the building owner was his wife. He was planning to purchase it through a third party at below market value, using modified lease, agreements I never authorized. I showed them the email evidence Caroline had compiled. The same week he called me just a housewife at his party, he was finalizing plans to steal my primary asset. James shook his head slowly. This isn't just marriage problems. This is comprehensive business fraud. Which is why Richardson and Associates is now under investigation by the State Ethics Board, why their business accounts are frozen, and why Dominic is currently sitting in a coffee shop trying to figure out how to rebuild a career that was built on stolen opportunities. I closed the portfolio and looked at both of them directly. The question now is whether you'd like to work with the actual developer who's been designing your projects, or if you'd prefer to wait and see if Dominic can reconstruct his business, without access to my work, my building, or my subsidized operating costs. The answer, as I'd expected, wasn't difficult for them to reach. When can we start? Patricia asked. 6 months later, I stood in my new corner office on the 22nd floor of the downtown high-rise I'd purchased after selling Richardson Tower. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now 3 floors higher than Dominic had ever been, with a view that encompassed the entire city, including the building where he'd once operated his fraudulent empire. Richardson Development Group had exploded back to life the moment I'd reclaimed my professional identity. The Henderson Group project broke ground in March. Morrison Industries signed their headquarters relocation contract in April. The innovation. District development that Dominic had tried to claim credit for was now the crown jewel of my expanding portfolio, with a waiting list of tech companies eager to secure space. My assistant buzzed the intercom. Ms. Richardson? Dominic Walsh is here. He says he has an appointment. I checked my calendar, though I already knew what this was about. Send him in. The man who entered my office looked like a shadow of the confident financial planner who'd dismissed me as just a housewife 6 months ago. His suit was cheaper, his posture defeated, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything and was finally beginning to understand why. Terry, he said, remaining standing even when I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. Thank you for seeing me. What can I do for you, Dominic? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with having to ask his former wife for anything. I'm trying to rebuild. Start over. I've got a small practice now. Just basic financial planning. Nothing like Richardson and Associates was. I'm aware. I'd been keeping tabs on his diminished circumstances through industry contacts. He was operating out of a strip mall office, handling individual retirement accounts and basic investment planning for middle-class clients. A far cry from the multi-million-dollar deals he'd been stealing from me. I need a reference, he said finally. For a business loan application? The bank wants to verify my previous experience, and since most of my major clients from Richardson and Associates ended up working with you, I leaned back in my chair, studying this man who'd spent years systematically erasing my professional identity while building his career on stolen opportunities. You want me to provide a reference for your business loan. I know how it sounds. But Terry, I've lost everything. The house is gone, my reputation is destroyed. Most of my former colleagues won't even return my calls. I'm just trying to build something legitimate this time. Something legitimate, I repeated, as opposed to a business built on redirecting. Your wife's clients, operating rent-free in your wife's building, and planning to steal your wife's primary asset? He winced. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm asking, not as your ex-husband, but as someone who's learned from his mistakes, for a chance to start over. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I'd been preparing for this moment. Inside was a single document, a character reference letter on Richardson Development Group letterhead. "I'll give you this reference," I said, sliding the envelope across my desk. "But there are conditions." His relief was palpable. "Anything. First, you will never again claim credit for work you didn't do. Second, you will never minimize another woman's professional accomplishments. And third, if you're ever in a position to help someone who's being professionally undermined or financially manipulated, you will speak up." He nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. Terry, I can't tell you how much this means." "I'm not doing this for you," I interrupted. "I'm doing this because the woman who used to serve drinks at company parties while being dismissed as just a housewife would want me to be better than the person who destroyed me." He took the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you." After he left, I returned to my window, looking out at the city skyline that now included several buildings I owned and multiple development projects bearing my signature. My calendar was full of meetings with CEOs and city planners. My phone rang constantly with opportunities from. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.